David breakaway board trying to come in alone. Shoot! Score! 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 He had it good, baby! He wins it for the Lightning! 5-4 in overtime!
Taylor the shot, redirected, score! Game 7, Montana St. Louis! We are going back to Tampa Bay! Cavalier spinning. Cavalier looking. Trying to drop it off. Brings it in himself. Left it in the middle. Shot.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Thunderstruck, one of our Bay Bolts shows. My name is Michael Wax, and I am joined by a very special guest today. You may know him on Twitter as JFresh, where he does some incredible things, including player card profiles, as well as other statistic and analytical things when it comes to NHL players and how coaches end up using those players. JFresh, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. How about you? You must be feeling pretty good right now.
I'm feeling really good. And I guess that's the first thing that we'll get going with is the Lightning series that just transpired. If any of you have seen, we did our latest Quick Strike episode on the Game 5 overtime victory against the Boston Bruins. It's always nice to beat the Bruins if you're any Atlantic team, but especially the Lightning. And, you know, it was really a case of the team having this next man up mentality. They didn't have Steven Stamkos. They didn't have Ryan McDonough for a long time. They didn't have Kucherov in that last game. In your estimation, whether it was the eye test or just seeing it analytically, was there someone that really, you know, either drove play or saved the series for the Lightning?
Well, I from what I've seen and from stats that I've had the opportunity to look at as well, I mean, that third line, which was essentially put together on the strength of a really effective trade deadline, just is really, I think, turning heads and proving a lot of us right. You know, I was kind of in the category of people who was super high on Blake Coleman, especially. I actually had him as my Selke front runner this year, which wasn't a particularly popular opinion at the time, but I think people are starting to really get a sense for not only how well the Lightning kind of handled the trade deadline and targeted the right players, but just kind of the strength of the guys that they got. So I think that the strengths that those players have in terms of especially their forechecking, their speed are going to be pretty well equipped if they do end up matching up against the Islanders. Like, I think that that's a perfect matchup and maybe something that could be able to give the Lightning an upper hand. So those are two guys who are really standing out for me. Are Goodrow and Coleman.
Yeah, and the Lightning got them not only because of the fact that, you know, they are good defensively and they can chip in offensively, but they have that sort of grit that they needed last year that didn't end up getting last year, and it hurt them. So, you know, we talk about those types of players. And one player that has really impressed me is Andre Palat. And I don't know if it's because he had just a hot series when it came to shooting, if he put himself in the right position, or if he is better than, you know, even us Lightning fans give him credit for.
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes back to what you said with, you know, about the grit that those other players provide, is that I think people kind of get the wrong idea when they think about like what having good analytics means. And I think in a lot of cases, people kind of conceive of like good analytics as meaning you're a soft skill player who doesn't forecheck or doesn't get to the dirty areas. And I think that in a lot of cases is super wrong. And I think the Lightning have kind of exposed just how wrong that is by prioritizing guys who actually do drive play while providing those kind of, whether you want to call them intangible or eye test benefits that those two players do. In the case of Palat, I mean, Palat is a guy who's kind of gotten a little bit of a rough ride in terms of his you know, league-wide opinion of him. And, you know, I guess based on what you said, that might apply to the Lightning as well. I think part of that is the contract. I think part of that is people having maybe too high expectations for him following the triplets here. But yeah, I mean, his analytics have always been pretty strong. I think the case of like the Lightning needing to move him has always been more of a cap space thing than anything else. And I mean, God, if you're the Lightning right now, you are just overjoyed with how Andre Platt is doing in these playoffs, because he's probably going to be one of the first guys who has to go to make some space. And he has gone from cap dump to potentially like decent return in the space of just a couple weeks. So that's definitely something to celebrate about if you're the Lightning.
Yeah, when he ends up going, because eventually he will. I mean, everybody does. I'll be pretty sad because I met him back in 2015, and he's just a really good guy. And you know, I've been a huge fan of him since then. So it's gonna be tough. But the final question for this particular series is I saw a lot of people saying after Game 5 that the Bruins Cup window was closed, and you know, David Krejci in his post game said, you know, we only have like 1 to 3 years left. Is it that overblown, or like is their cup window officially closing?
I mean, it's definitely limited in you know, just based on, you know, a lot of people would think of like Chara. You know, I think we saw just kind of how washed up he is at this point. Not that you can really blame a 43-year-old for being washed up. He's probably like the same age as Martin St. Louis or something around there. So, I mean, you can't really blame him for that. But, I mean, the fact of the matter is that Patrice Bergeron and Brad Marchand aren't getting any younger. Bergeron especially, I think, he's 35 at this point. The way that he plays, I think, is pretty sustainable. But, I mean, expecting what you've gotten from him for the past decade, you know, to project outwards is probably a little optimistic. Same thing with kind of Krejci and Marchand, you know, especially with Marchand's emergence as kind of an actual elite player in the past 5 years or so. But I mean, when you really kind of back up and look at this roster, they still have David Pastrnak, who I'd say is a top 5 right wing in the NHL. You have Charlie McAvoy, who I honestly thought was potentially the best defenseman in the NHL this year in terms of the regular season. Now, obviously, that didn't turn out too well in the playoffs, but, you know, you're talking about a foundational piece back there. I mean, there are teams that are rebuilding that would absolutely kill to have the foundation of, you know, Pastrnak, McAvoy, DeBrusk, you know, and I think that people could say, oh, like, what about the goaltending? But, I mean, based on everything that we know about goaltending, you know, the goalie really isn't as much a part of the core as you might necessarily think it is, especially with what we've seen with kind of young goalies turning out to be disappointing or actually not panning out or having kind of one hot season. So I think even if the Bruins were a rebuilding team right now, they would have one of the strongest cores out there, and they're not. They're a competitive team. So I think that they've built something that's pretty sustainable. The question is just going to be, how do they move forward from this? Do they kind of overcorrect, or do they kind of do what the Washington Capitals did and kind of, you know, run it back until it works, until you absolutely can't do that anymore, which I think actually might be kind of the more pragmatic response.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a lot of people, and I felt this way, saying, you know, they were overmatched, and I thought they were in the series, but they do have a ton of young talent. So, you know, if they could probably get a couple more pieces, you know, why not run it back? Going over to the other East series, the New York Islanders are currently leading the Philadelphia Flyers 3-2 in their best of 7. And something interesting that I've seen is that the Philadelphia firepower has sort of been neutralized through Barry Trotz's system. And just wondering, like, is there a specific thing in that system that, like, no team can break through? Because he's won a Stanley Cup. He's gone to playoffs basically every year he's been the coach.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly something that team does in terms of stacking the blue line. You know, it's almost kind of like a new evolution of that kind of old-time hockey, you know, track that you would think about. But, I mean, this is a very, very low-risk team. They play a super conservative style. If you look at some of their kind of micro stats about moving the puck out or attacking the blue line or things like that, you're always going to find the Islanders near the bottom of the list. You know, that's just not the way they play. And I think that can really frustrate a lot of teams if they don't really know how to deal with it properly. I mean, as a Penguins fan myself, I saw the Penguins run into a complete wall with that and then just get completely frustrated by it. I think that's to a certain extent what's happening with the Flyers right now. But I think it's a really good situation for the Islanders because their roster kind of on paper, and if you look at their kind of underlying numbers, isn't particularly strong. It isn't necessarily very well put together. There's a lot of kind of bottom six grinders who are on these big contracts. The same thing goes for, some defensemen. We're talking about like Nick Leddy, who has really struggled, who is not a guy who necessarily should be playing regular minutes on a Stanley Cup contending team. But because the system is kind of so strong and everyone's kind of locked into it, it's paying dividends right now. So like I said before, I think there is a way to beat it. And that way is just having the forechecking and then the willingness to just kind of barrel through it until eventually it pays off. But obviously that's not necessarily working that well for the Flyers, and their top line is really struggling to get any production or anything into the back of the net.
Well, you just mentioned the top line, and that sort of leads into my next thing about this series. Yesterday, we saw both Sean Couturier and Matthew Barzal go down. Which player is going to be more impacted, or which team is going to be more impacted by their star player going down?
Well, I mean, here's the thing: is I think that Sean Couturier is a better player. I don't think Barzal's kind of a tricky situation because Barzal is clearly an immensely talented player, but I think that playing in the system that he does, like the Barry Trotz system, has had a demonstrable effect on his actual results. I mean, not just in terms of his point totals going down, but I mean, you look up and down his kind of underlying results as well. He's not nearly as ambitious as he was. He's not really able to generate the same type of offense that he used to. But at the same time, when you talk about kind of how much they carry on the team, I feel like Barzal is kind of like the only guy they have that does a lot of things. Like if you break it down in terms of, who's carrying the puck in the offensive zone, who's breaking the puck into the offensive zone, who's holding on to it, it's always Barzal, and it's by far Barzal. And like I said, kind of the Islanders, because they have flaws in how they've been put together, it's really difficult to identify other guys on the roster who might be able to take that responsibility. Whereas with Couturier, I think that there are other skilled players or other good two-way players on the Flyers roster, whether or not they're having the same quality of results right now, who can maybe step in. I just don't see that on the Islanders. So, I mean, short term, I think it's going to affect them in the last potentially 2 games of the series. But especially if they go up against the Lightning, I think that they will quickly find themselves having a lot of trouble generating offense and scoring against a Lightning team that is no slouch at defending either.
Yeah, we see, I think, the only team that has trouble scoring goals in these playoffs that's still there is the Islanders. So the loss of Barzal is really big. Transitioning over to the West real quick, Colorado and Dallas. Dallas is leading the series 3-2, but not before Colorado destroys them in Game 5, putting up 6 goals in a 3-goal win. But in, I believe it was Game 1, we saw Philip Grubauer go down, and I didn't think it was going to be that impactful. I thought Francouz could hold the fort. But was Philip Grubauer that important to their success?
I mean, I think Grubauer is the guy who really gets underrated because he doesn't have the name recognition, and he's kind of gotten hurt a bunch of times. And I've heard a lot of kind of rumors about how the Avalanche are a team that's really going to have to go after a goalie this summer. And in my mind, that's not really the case. I think that the Grubauer-Francouz tandem did very well this season. Grubauer has, in the past, had pretty consistently solid results. There are injury issues with him, as obviously is coming out in those playoffs. But I think overall, like the Avalanche have been able to rely on some pretty solid goaltending in the past little while. And obviously, I've said this many, many times before. I actually wrote a piece about it just a couple days ago. I mean, you can't really count on a goalie to really do you anything. With the exception of kind of very few cases, goaltending is incredibly inconsistent, not only in terms of kind of season-to-season predictability, but even from your season to your playoffs, which is how you end up with things like, Joonas Korpisalo being a terrible goalie for the past 3 years and then breaking the NHL record for saves in a game. Or on the other end of things, Connor Hellebuyck is, a god this season and then below average in the playoffs. These are the kind of things that happen in net, and you want to put yourself in as good a position as possible to maximize your odds that you're going to get good goaltending. And I think the Avs are in a pretty good position with that. I think Francouz is a pretty good backup goalie. Grubauer is a pretty good starter, but sometimes it falls apart. And obviously it fell apart pretty spectacularly. So that's definitely an issue for them. But I mean, they're such a good team in front of their goalie that really they should be able to kind of stand for the bleeding here and hopefully make this a series, because I just personally, I enjoy watching the Avalanche a lot more than I enjoy watching the Dallas Stars. So I would not mind seeing them move on.
Yeah, if I had to pick a second favorite team, it would most likely be the Avalanche, just because of their plethora of talent, both offensively and defensively. Speaking of one of their offensive talents, I think Nathan MacKinnon has really, kicked it even into a even higher gear than he did in the regular season. He's leading the NHL in points right now. I know points aren't indicative of every kind of performance, but it really does feel like he's taken that mantle of, and I know I'm going to get some flack for saying this, but like best player in the NHL, because he is leading his team to potentially the third round if they can make this comeback. And I don't know if that's something that is translated through, the stuff that you do and the stuff that I know that like Alan from at Loser Points on Twitter does. But I would be very surprised to hear, like, at least he's not top 3.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think he's absolutely top 3. I'm a little biased. I'm from Halifax. I actually grew up with him. So I do have and he played for the Mooseheads and everything like that. So I'm biased in favor of him, but I think that it's pretty easy to make the case that he's top 3. The tricky thing, I mean, with the playoffs, always the tricky thing if we're talking about analytics, it's that all of those kind of like isolated models that are kind of the best indicator that we have right now, those aren't available in the playoffs. Like, those are based on the regular season. The sample size just isn't big enough in the playoffs. So we really can't make that kind of assessment, which means that in these cases, the eye test and points, and then maybe a little bit of a sprinkling of kind of raw analytics like expected goal percentage and stuff, is the best way to go. And I mean, there's no doubt MacKinnon is one of the best players in the league. I think you could easily make the case that he's a top 2 player in the league. I still do kind of defer to Connor McDavid, even while recognizing, as I've said a lot of times before, that McDavid is one of, if not the worst defensive centers in the NHL, and MacKinnon doesn't quite have that defect. I do think that it's kind of easy to, when Connor McDavid is kind of not playing and Nathan MacKinnon is, I think that there's a little bit of recency bias that comes through, but there's really no doubt that MacKinnon has been spectacular in the playoffs. He's probably the most dynamic player in the league, and definitely the most dynamic player who's still playing right now. And there's a case to be made, and it's not as ridiculous as it might sound to say that MacKinnon is right there in that conversation.
Yeah, definitely. To transition over to our last series, I have a couple other things I want to talk about. Vegas is currently leading Vancouver 3-2. Thatcher Demko actually stole Game 5. It was not close. The shots were 43-17. It was another case of you talking about how goaltending is just, throw it up in the air and see what happens.
Yeah, there you go. And you saw the Vancouver people today saying that Thatcher Demko can now be like a Vezina caliber starter for the next season based on a single game of action, which I think should tell you all you need to know about how people make conclusions based on small goalie sample sizes.
I mean, Markstrom has carried them. I don't know if I would be so thankful to see Demko in that next season without Markstrom. But the one thing that has really jumped out to me in this series in particular is we look at every other team in the playoffs. Colorado has Nathan MacKinnon. Tampa Bay has Braden Point. Philadelphia has Sean Couturier. Vegas strikes me as a team that doesn't really have that real number one center. I know William Karlsson is doing a very good job between Max Pacioretty and Mark Stone, but he's not that really sort of franchise guy, even though he's signed to that sort of contract. And it's very strange to see how their success is built off of wingers instead of centers.
Yeah, if anyone's curious about that, there's an article that Jack Hahn, who used to work for the Maple Leafs front office a couple of years ago, he wrote an article about how Vegas kind of melds its system around the centers that it has, and how that's kind of a big reason that things have worked out so well for them. Because you're right. I mean, Paul Stastny had a very nice season. I don't think many people would say that he's a star number one center in the way that these other teams have. Mark Stone is obviously the best player on that team, one of the best players in the league. But like we always talk about, kind of building off of a winger without that number one center, that's not usually the formula that you look to in terms of building a Stanley Cup team. But I think what Vegas has done is they've recognized the limitations of being kind of an expansion team where you're not going to be able to necessarily bring in that franchise number one center. And the wingers are maybe going to be a little bit easier to acquire, and have essentially built a system that makes the center's job as easy as possible. Like the center's job in the Vegas system is essentially to support the wingers, and which is why you've seen guys who are kind of maybe not the most naturally talented players, but who are smart players like Chandler Stevenson and Nicola Watt. They're kind of coming in and, they have a very specific job. They get in the right positions. They get the puck to the wingers and they put up really, really great numbers as a result. And I think that Vegas has been pretty pragmatic in terms of recognizing the talent that they have and building a system around it, which I think is why they found so much success and why it wouldn't surprise me if they're able to go all the way.
I mean, it's been pretty shocking to see them in the past couple of years be able to acquire those big name wingers. But, you're exactly right when it comes to, building success around them and giving the centers the easiest job as possible. Another thing that they do really well, and I feel like this guy doesn't get enough credit. And when I saw him get taken off the expansion draft board, I said, Anaheim, what are you doing giving away Shea Theodore? I know you have a really solid top four, but this guy's going to come back and bite you. And I think he's done that. And I know that a lot of people are starting to open their eyes to Shea Theodore in these playoffs, but, I've seen him for a long time, and maybe this is his coming out party.
Yeah, Theodore's a really talented player. He's a really kind of controversial player in the stats community increasingly, because in terms of kind of his isolated, like your expected goal impacts and everything like that, there's an argument that he's like a top 3 defenseman in the NHL, which I think for a lot of people kind of doesn't quite pass the smell test or doesn't quite hold up. And I know that Vegas has kind of deployed him in kind of a weird way, where they've essentially played him on the second pair pretty consistently, even though he's putting up these results. And they've also sheltered him quite a bit, which I find super interesting. Like essentially that Nate Schmidt, Braden McNabb pairing gets like completely buried in terms of their matchups. And then Theodore is kind of allowed to prey on those lower matchups, which, in terms of like the fancy stats and everything, all that is kind of accounted and adjusted for. And Theodore still turns out great. But it just means that kind of, again, we're talking about a situation where Vegas is kind of using coaching decisions and deployments to kind of maximize their situations here. I don't know necessarily how true that is in these playoffs. I've noticed that he's spent quite a bit of time against that Pettersson line, and he's done extremely well there. But, I mean, whether or not you think he's like a great defenseman, a number one defenseman, a top 3 defenseman in the NHL, it's great to see a guy like that get the recognition that he deserves kind of from the broader hockey universe. And I think that's something that is happening to a lot of guys in these playoffs. Talking about like Braden Point is one guy who I think is getting recognized as an elite number one center. Elias Pettersson as well is kind of up there. Mark Stone as well. Like these are guys who the analytics community have been kind of crowing about for ages and ages, who are really getting their due in terms of the national media or whatever you want to call them, kind of recognizing them as these elite talents.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of that 50-50 guy where I look at analytics, but I'm not 100% basing my opinions off them. But whenever you guys start to talk about a player, I will start to look at them and I'll be like, nah, these guys need more attention. Like, I don't know why they're not getting it. And I feel like, the players that you just mentioned, Stone, Theodore, Braden Point, Elias Pettersson, have all been solid contributors and even better in these playoffs. Getting to the news and notes from this particular week, and a lot of it came just today. Jake Allen was traded from the St. Louis Blues to the Montreal Canadiens, along with a 7th-round pick in 2022 for a 3rd and a 7th-round pick in 2020. And I know we talked about how goaltending is a bit of, voodoo, and you don't really know how to manage that when it comes to, looking at just basic stats or analytic stats. things can change on a dime. But you were talking about earlier how, this season is not going to get replicated this past season he just had, but he is going to be that solid backup that Montreal needs.
Yeah, the thing about Jake Allen is that like his performance this year, like as a backup in St. Louis, was like exceptional. Like he did absolutely everything and more that you could possibly ask of your backup goalie. Like you just alluded to, is that going to replicate itself? Is he going to be the best backup in the league 2 years in a row? Probably not. But at the same time, here's a guy who kind of was shoehorned into a starter's job that he didn't really deserve. He had really, really bad results as a starter in St. Louis. Like he was almost always in the bottom 5 of the league. But there's two things. The first thing is obviously in Montreal, he's not going to be their starter, which is, a great situation kind of for everyone involved, because it means that, you really can't expect him to get overloaded like he did those previous years. And also, he's in a situation that he just succeeded in last year. Hopefully he's just able to kind of keep that going. He has kind of all that experience as a backup now, which hopefully will serve him pretty well. The second thing is that even if he is just as bad as he was when he was like a really bad starter, like his numbers as a bad starter were still better than the backup goaltending that Montreal's had in the past couple of years. Like Keith Kincaid, Antti Niemi, like they have not been able to count on a goalie to back up Carey Price, and in part because they've cheaped out. Like they have said, you know what, we have Carey Price, he's expensive. We're going to play him for 70 games. So we're just going to get any random waiver wire fodder for league men and play him behind Carey Price. And that has a dual impact of obviously screwing you for 12 games a year and essentially doing you to a loss, but also meaning that you have to lean too heavily on Carey Price. And I think we kind of saw, with his performance in the playoffs this year, that Price has clearly a ceiling of ability. And what we were seeing him this time around is kind of after a long break. And that's not something that he's really had kind of within seasons, because he's expected to play so many minutes. So like when I was talking about the Canadiens a few weeks ago, I essentially said the two biggest things they have to do this year are fire the power play coach and hire a new one, and get a good backup for Carey Price who can lighten the load on him. And they did that first thing. So, you can kind of say like, oh, they're paying $15 million for goaltending. But at the end of the day, they don't have a cap crunch this year. It's coming next year when Allen's off the books. For the time being, this is good for Price. It's probably going to be pretty good for Allen. And I think it actually is going to benefit the Habs a lot, even if, you can say, oh, did they give up a third instead of a fifth or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it right on the head when you're talking about how, this is going to be a win for the Canadiens, even if, that price tag is pretty substantial.
Yeah.
But again, they don't have to worry about it this year. Shifting over from the Canadiens to the Panthers, another Atlantic Division team. They just hired their new general manager, Bill Zito, from the Columbus Blue Jackets. Not exactly sure what he was in charge of in Columbus, but, with everything going on between Dale Talland and the analytics people, I think it's good that they finally have a GM that is not a retread and that can finally, go in and do what he wants to. But he is going to have to obey the owner's wishes. And from what we're hearing, that is cutting substantial salary.
Yeah, it's going to be, this is going to be an interesting summer, because we have like all of these teams that were like in the play-in round, like who were reasonably competitive teams who were trying to win. And all of them have been directed essentially to rebuild. Like I think that the Coyotes are all the word is that they're going to kind of tear it down. The Panthers, I think there's good reason to believe that they're going to at least like massively retool and drop a whole bunch of salary. I don't know much about Bill Zito. All I know is that his name always seems to come up, and people seemed pretty happy that he got the job. So, literally, he could not be worse than Dale Talon, if only because he just doesn't have the opportunity to spend $70 million on a goalie again. Like there's already a $70 million goalie there, which means he can't do that again, which means that he will be better than Dale Talon.
I mean, talking as someone who is a fan of almost a $70 million or a part of a team that has a $70 million goalie, that doesn't bode well, but it's okay. And then you mentioned earlier you're a Penguins fan. There were a couple of news pieces that came out about the Penguins. First of all, Todd Reardon and Mike Berlucci will be hired by the Penguins as assistant coaches. I believe Reardon will be the power play coach, and Berlucci, I'm not exactly sure. I don't
think he's
remember.
doing the forwards and penalty kill.
Forwards and penalty kill.
I don't really know anything about like any of these front office guys or assistant coaches. Apparently, Reardon did a good job with the power play, like back when he was on this team the first time. You know, Vellucci, there's been a lot of hype around him as like a potential replacement for Mike Sullivan. So hopefully that works out. You know, I just have my fingers crossed. I really don't think that the power play could be coached any worse than it was before. So I hopefully that will turn out okay.
Well, do you think these hires, and I think a lot of people think this way, are a wake-up call to Sullivan to get in shape or he's going to get fired?
I hope so. I mean, I like Mike Sullivan. I think that he, like, again, like if you ask me on January 31st, who I thought should win the Jack Adams this year, I would have said Mike Sullivan, and now we're talking about him getting fired. And I think that that's a testament not to recency bias, but to just like how extensively he f***ed up this during the playoffs, during the end of the season. I mean, he made decisions that directly led to the Penguins falling out of the bye, and then made decisions that led directly to them losing against the Habs. And, there's really no way around that. He's going to have to shape up from that. And if taking away his assistant coaches was what it took to kind of show him that the clock is ticking, then so be it. There are certain other toys that I would prefer be taken away from him first, but I guess we'll see in the offseason whether that actually happens. But I'm fine with it, honestly.
And final piece of news coming from the Penguins was announced by General Manager Jim Rutherford that Justin Schultz will not be back. I know that you were not a fan of that news with all your pieces in the past couple of weeks. He is not the problem on that third pair. That problem is Jack Johnson.
Well, it's a little complicated because I mean, Justin Schultz is a bad defenseman, and I do not want him to be on the Penguins anymore. Like, let me be clear about that. Like, if like the Penguins not re-signing Justin Schultz is very good news for me. The issue is that he is kind of getting blamed for absolutely everything that went wrong with that third pair. And I think you're right. Justin Schultz was a problem on the third pair, but there was one much bigger, slower problem on that third pair, which is obviously Jack Johnson. And that's a guy who they have avoided any kind of reckoning with or accountability for. And I'm really kind of starting to get the sense based on, what we've heard from Penguins beat writers, from Elliot Friedman, that like this isn't PR. Like they legitimately think that Jack Johnson was good this season. He was good in the playoffs, and that there's no issues with him, and he can be their third pairing defenseman this year, which is disastrous and potentially window closing, but that just seems to be how it is. The fun thing for me with Justin Schultz, just to add on to that, is at the end of that series, Rutherford went after Schultz, Sullivan went after Schultz. They basically like piled onto the guy, saying he was the problem, like he was bad. We're really disappointed with him in these playoffs. He's so horrible. He's going to be not coming back to the team. And meanwhile, they were playing him like every single time the Penguins were trailing, Justin Schultz was on the ice. Like every time they had the extra attacker, Justin Schultz was on the ice. Every time the first power play unit came out, Justin Schultz was on the ice, like even more so than Chris Letang. Like they were deploying him as their number one offensive defenseman, as bizarre as that sounds. And then they turn around 2 days later and say, oh yeah, we were really disappointed with him all series. Like that doesn't add up to me. That reads to me as absolute just covering their asses and doing it for the sake of one of the worst defensemen, if not the worst defenseman in the NHL. So it's just going to keep getting frustrated. And I'm kind of trying to selectively disengage with kind of being outraged about anything the Penguins do until Jack Johnson is firmly in or out of the lineup starting next season.
Well, you are definitely a passionate Penguins fan, which is always nice to see. Seeing people that care about hockey this much is always a pleasure. And it was a pleasure. Thank you so much, JFresh, for joining us. Where can people find you to either read your columns or see some of your visuals?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at JFresh Hockey. You can see, whatever my insane hot takes are there, or occasionally I'll post some of the visualizations on there if there's stuff that's in the news. If you want to kind of get a further look at the visualizations and have kind of full access to a whole bunch of different toys, including the player cards, like a roster generator that kind of estimates based on wins above replacement how that team will do in the standings, and that kind of, you can do that for any season going back for the past 15 years. All of that is available on my Patreon, which is also under the name JFresh. It's $5 a month to get full access to all that stuff. And if you want to read what I have to say, I've been writing a whole bunch of blog posts and analysis, kind of using those visualizations, but also maybe diving a little bit deeper, like you said, kind of that 50-50 eye test analytics vibe, to maybe kind of, instead of just posting the analytics, maybe diving a little bit more deeply into them and figuring out kind of whether there might be exceptions or how deep you can really go with them. And that's on Substack. So that would be substack.com/JFreshHockey. And that pretty much covers me.
All right. And don't forget, if you guys watch The Athletic, or if you guys watch Sportsnet, or read The Athletic, you might be able to see JFresh on there. He's been on there a couple of times. Well, again, thank you so much to JFresh for joining us. This has been another edition of our Thunderstruck podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at @Bay_Bolt for news, notes, and game updates. We do get updates during every single game. Once again, for Michael Wax and JFresh, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and we will see you next week for the next edition of Thunderstruck. Thanks, guys.